Hi, I'm Pastor Kerry. Happy New Year. Hope you had a great holiday season. Before we get started, there are a couple of things I want to encourage you to do. First, I want to encourage you to have a copy of the sermon notes. And if you don't already have them, you can go to the link that's right down below the video. It'll take you to a place where you can print a set of the sermon notes for yourself. I also want to encourage you to have some communion elements. You want to have some bread or a cracker. You want to have some juice or some wine. If you don't have juice or wine, really any beverage would suffice. But you'll want to have those communion elements because here in about 20 minutes when we get to the end of the online sermon, we'll move right into a time of communion with you. So if you need any of those things, then I would encourage you to pause the playback right now. Get whatever you need once everything's ready, then go ahead and resume the playback. You know, something that almost all public speakers do, and I'm sure you figured this out by now, is before they jump into whatever topic they want to talk about, they'll do something to try to grab your attention. And a lot of times they will tell a story. That's one of my favorite ways to introduce a sermon. Another thing that some public speakers will do is they will ask a question that hopefully will get the audience that they're speaking to engaged. And this past Tuesday morning, as I was preaching this sermon for the very first time over at Eastmont, I asked what I thought was going to be a rhetorical question. And the question that I asked was, hey, how many of you, by a show of hands, how many of you think that our current president is a perfect president? And then I laughed and I said, no, I'm kidding. Don't raise your hands. Either way, don't raise your hands. And I said, along those same lines, I said, how many of you think that our previous president was a perfect president? Again, I'm kidding. Don't raise your hands. I am just throwing that out there just to kind of get the wheels turning. I said, obviously, I don't think any of us here would say that our current president or the previous president were the perfect president. And I said, at the same time, you named some of the greatest presidents in U.S. history. And even with those presidents, I don't think anyone would say that they were the perfect president. There's no such thing as a perfect president. I went on to say that when I was growing up, that it was not long after John F. Kennedy had been assassinated that I was in elementary school and middle school, and I remember seeing his picture everywhere. And I saw his picture in the homes of people who were politically conservative, politically liberal, and everywhere in between. And I said, I think that back when I was growing up, that people thought that JFK was pretty close to being a perfect president. Said, so it's been interesting over the last several decades as we've learned more and more about JFK, how maybe even that perception of him has changed. I said, even with someone like Abraham Lincoln, even with someone like George Washington, I said, great presidents, arguably the best presidents that we've ever had. But were they perfect presidents? No, because there's no such thing as a perfect president. There are good presidents, and there are not so good presidents, but the perfect president, that probably doesn't exist. So, that was the way that I tried to introduce this sermon that you're about to hear on Tuesday morning, the very first time I preached it over at Eastmont. And I felt like what I'd done was pretty safe, pretty innocuous. And so it was interesting because when the chapel service ended and I went around and I was kind of shaking hands with everybody who came to the chapel service, because that's what I always do at Eastmont, is I shake everybody's hand after the service. I had shaken probably half a dozen hands already. And I got to one of the chapel attendees who was pretty upset with me. And so I said, oh, I'm sorry, what happened? What did I say? And so this chapel attendee, in a rather loud voice, and this is not a big room that we're in, so I mean everybody who was there could very clearly hear this. They went on to list off, and I'm not going to say if it is the current president or the previous president, but I'm going to say that this chapel attendee went on to list off all of the things that was wonderful about one of our previous two presidents, either the current or the previous one. And they were really upset at me for suggesting that maybe this president wasn't a perfect president. And I said, well, look, I'm not saying that they're a bad president. And the interesting thing was that this person was actually defending the president that I happen to prefer between the current president and the previous president. This person was defending the one that I liked out of the two. But you know how politically divided our world is right now, and I just didn't want to overcommit there in this group of big group of people. And so I said, you know what, the person that you're talking about, I like them very much. And I felt like that was a safe thing to say. I said, but I don't think they were the perfect president. And this person then went on to, defend the president more. And I repeated myself and I said, I like this president that they were describing very much. I really like him a lot. But I don't think that he was the perfect president. And this person just wasn't having it. So I think that particular Eastmont Chapel service has lost a future attendee. I think I chased them off. So who knows? Maybe I'll chase you off. Maybe I'll manage to offend someone who's watching this online sermon today. Maybe this will be the last time that you ever watch one of these online sermons. I don't know. But all of that is to say, today we are going to be hearing from someone who should have been an expert on the topic of leadership and leading a nation, on what makes the perfect national leader. It just so happens that the lectionary psalm for January 6th of 2023 was written by King Solomon. And it's interesting because of course, that the Psalms in the Old Testament, they're a collection of poems and songs that were written by a number of different authors. King David, wrote the lion's share of the Psalms, but David's son Solomon wrote a couple of the Psalms. And it just so happens that we're looking at one of the two Psalms that are attributed to Solomon. Today, we're going to take a look at an abridged version of the 72nd Psalm. So, let's go ahead and take a look right now. 72nd Psalm of Solomon. Endow the king with your justice, O God, the royal son with your righteousness. May he judge your people in righteousness, your afflicted ones with justice. May the mountains bring prosperity to the people, the hills the fruit of righteousness. May he defend the afflicted among the people and save the children of the needy. May he crush the oppressor. May he endure as long as the sun, as long as the moon through all generations. May he be like rain falling on a mown field, like showers watering the earth. In his days may the righteous flourish and prosperity abound till the moon is no more. May all kings bow down to him and all nations serve him. For he will deliver the needy who cry out, the afflicted who have no one to help. He will take pity on the weak and the needy and save the needy from death. He will rescue them from oppression and violence, for precious is their blood in his sight. Long may he live. May people ever pray for him and bless him all day long. May grain abound throughout the land. On the tops of the hills may it sway. May the crops flourish like Lebanon and thrive like the grass of the field. May his name endure forever. May it continue as long as the sun. Then all nations will be blessed through him, and they will call him blessed. And may God bless the reading of the inspiring word. So, in this psalm, Solomon is talking about what he would want for a king. And it would be interesting to know if Solomon wrote this before he became the king of Israel, if Solomon wrote this after he became the king of Israel. Let's go ahead and do what we always do. Let's go ahead and take a closer look at the psalm. Let's talk through it and let's make sure that we're tracking with Solomon and understanding what he was trying to convey in the psalm. After we talk through the psalm, then we'll do what we always do, and we will attempt to make some application of the psalm for our lives. So, at the very beginning, it tells us that this is a song attributed to Solomon. And the first thing that is said is the psalmist says, "Endow the king with your justice, O God, the royal son with your righteousness." Now, an obvious question to ask there in verse 1 is, are we talking about the same person? Or are we talking about two different people? Because it says, "Endow the king with your justice," and then the royal son with your righteousness. So is Solomon talking about David, his dad? Did he write this before he became king? And then the royal son, was he talking about himself? You know, it's really hard to say. Most Bible scholars think that this was probably a reference to the same person. That Solomon was probably talking about the fact that the king was also undoubtedly going to be a royal son of the previous king. So we're probably, not certainly, but probably talking about the same person here. At the end of the day, it probably doesn't make a huge difference, but I know the first time that I took a look at this psalm, that was a question that jumped out at me. Are we talking about the same person, or are we talking about two different people? The commentaries that I looked at seem to think that we're talking about the same person here. And then the psalmist says, "May the king judge your people in righteousness, your afflicted ones with justice." So already there's a sense that the royal people are not having the best time, because right at the very start it tells us that they are afflicted and they need justice. So that's the first stanza. That's verses 1 and 2. And then we get into the second stanza, verses 3 through 7, and the psalmist says, "May the mountains bring prosperity to the people, the hills the fruit of righteousness." So there's that word again. That's the third time that that word righteousness has appeared in a total of 3 verses. So obviously righteousness is something that's very important to the psalmist, assuming that that was Solomon. "May he defend the afflicted among the people and save the children of the needy, and may he crush the oppressor." So obviously the psalmist wants this king, whether this is Solomon talking about himself, maybe talking about his dad, maybe he wrote this before he became the king, whoever the psalmist is, they're wanting the king to defend them against their enemies and crush their oppressors. And then in verse 5, this psalmist says something interesting. "May he endure as long as the sun, as long as the moon through all generations." Now, I don't know of any human king that is going to endure as long as the sun. Most of us have about 7 or 8 decades on this planet, give or take. Back then, I think that the average life expectancy was around 30 or 40 years. And so for someone to endure for as long as the sun wasn't going to happen. It makes you certainly wonder if this psalm has a double meaning. And if maybe the psalmist is referring not just to an earthly king, because it certainly sounds in many parts of the psalm like we're talking about an earthly king, but maybe if this is a messianic psalm as well, and if some of these verses at least have a reference to the Messiah. Verse 5 kind of sounds like it, doesn't it? Then we get to verse 6, and here's a beautiful image. "May the king be like rain falling on a mown field, may like showers watering the earth." Grass, after it's been mown, what does it need? It needs water to replenish itself. And the psalmist says that's what the king needs to be, like rain on this freshly mown field. "In his days may the righteous," there's that word again, righteous, "may the righteous flourish and prosperity abound, till the moon is no more." So now talking about a time when the moon is no longer in existence. So again, are we talking about an earthly king, or are we talking about the King of Kings? Certainly sounds like it could be the latter. "May all kings bow down to him, and all nations serve him," it says in verse 11 as we start into the third verse. And again, back then, 3,000 years ago, there were not a lot of other earthly kings that were going to bow down to the King of Israel. And all nations were not serving the nation of Israel. So again, it doesn't sound like we're talking about an earthly king. It doesn't sound like we're talking about just Israel here. It sounds like maybe we're talking about the King of Kings. Sounds like maybe we're talking about the Messiah. But let's push on through the third stanza. He'll deliver the needy who cry out, the afflicted who have no one to help. He'll take pity on the weak and the needy, save the needy from death. Now we've got a new recurring word, and that word is needy. Deliver the needy who cry out, take pity on the weak and the needy, save the needy from death. He'll rescue them from oppression and violence because precious is their blood in his sight. So now there's a sense that the needy have been hurt, and this king is going to help them in their time of need. Then we get down to the fourth stanza, verses 15 through 17, and the psalmist says, "Long may this king live. May people ever pray for him," not to him, for him. So it sounds like now we're talking about an earthly king, "and bless him all day long. May grain abound throughout the land, may on the tops of the hills may it sway." So here's another beautiful poetic image, the idea of looking at a hilltop and seeing grain swaying in silhouette on the top of a hill. May the crops flourish like Lebanon and thrive like the grass of the field. May his name endure forever. May it continue as long as the sun. And again, are we talking about an earthly king here? Maybe, but it sounds like we're talking about the King of Kings at this point, if it's going to continue as long as the sun. And then we get to this very end, this last verse, that's still a part of verse 17, but its own separate stanza at the end. "Then all nations will be blessed through him, and they will call him blessed." All nations are going to be blessed through this king. They will call him blessed. It sounds at this point like we're definitely talking about the Messiah. It sounds like we're definitely talking about the King of Kings. So what do we do with this majestic psalm? Let's go ahead now and let's acknowledge that this is a beautifully written psalm by Solomon, and let's go ahead and talk about three of the takeaways that this passage has for us. And I think the first important reminder the passage has for us is this: as people of faith, we should exemplify justice and righteousness. As people of faith, we should exemplify justice and righteousness. Those were a couple of recurring words in the first stanza, even in the second stanza of the psalm. Justice and righteousness. Isaiah chapter 30, verse 8 says, "The Lord is a God of justice." Isaiah 30:18, sorry about that. Isaiah 30:18 says, "The Lord is a God of justice." And friends, that's what we should want as well. And not just justice for ourselves. It's one thing for us to say, I want everything to be right and fair for me. But we need to take it the next step, because that's not what Solomon was saying in the psalm, that this king should be demanding justice for himself. Solomon was saying that a good king is going to demand justice for everybody that he was serving as king. And that's what we should want as well. We should want justice for everyone. And not just exemplify justice, but we should also try to exemplify righteousness in our lives. And that is not always easy, and that's something that we've talked about before. The idea of us trying to live good lives, to set good examples, that's something that all of us, I think we would agree that we want to do, that we try to do. None of us are perfect. There's no such thing as a perfect president. There's no such thing as a perfect king. There's no such thing as a perfect person of faith, is there? All of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, but we do our best. We try. We try to learn from our mistakes and do better next time. And in that way, we try to exemplify righteousness. So that is the first important reminder this passage has for us. The second is this: as people of faith, we should defend and help those who are in need. As people of faith, we should defend and help those who are in need. Because in the third stanza, that's what Solomon said that a good king should do. A good king should stand up for the needy. And it's interesting because Solomon makes that point, and then when we get to the end of the New Testament, another New Testament author makes that point as well. In James chapter 1, verse 27, it says that religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress. And so, friends, that is something that we are called to do as well. We are called to help the needy. That is what we should try to do as people of faith. Was a king called to do that? According to Solomon, yes. But is that something that we should do as well? Absolutely. And then, friends, that leads to the final reminder this passage has for us. As people of faith, we should pray for our leaders, no matter who they are. As people of faith, we should pray for our leaders, no matter who they are. I told the story about the person that I got really upset with me this past Tuesday morning. And, in that setting, it was so hard to try to spend some quality time with them and try to maybe, rebuild some bridges with them. At the end of the day, they ended up leaving, and I had to kind of talk to everybody else, and it's a tough situation like that. But one of the things that I certainly wanted to try to convey to that person is not only is the president that you're so fond of, is that the president that I'm fond of, but it's my job and it's your job and it's everybody's job to pray for the presidents that we like and the presidents that we don't like, and the senators that we like and that we don't like, and the members of the House and the governors and the mayors, and go on down the line, every leader. That's also true in our churches. If we have maybe a leader in our church that we're not incredibly fond of, we are called to pray for them. And one of the things that we know about prayer is that there's no guarantee that prayer is going to change somebody else, but there's a good chance that prayer is going to change us, isn't it? And I can honestly say that the president that out of the last two that I was, or that I wasn't particularly fond of, that I absolutely did pray for that president. And, friends, as we get ready to gather around the communion table, I think it's important for us to focus on the very last couple lines of this psalm, where Solomon said, all nations will be blessed through him. And again, undoubtedly a reference to the Messiah, undoubtedly a reference to Jesus. All nations were blessed through Jesus, through his sacrifice. And so right now, I want to remind you of Paul's words in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, where he talked about the Last Supper and how Jesus took bread and broke it and said, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. So right now, I want to encourage you to get your bread and your cup, and I will get mine. And here in just a moment, we're going to go ahead and partake together. Friends, the body of Christ, broken for us, we partake in remembrance of him. And the blood of Christ, shed for us, we drink in remembrance of him. Let us pray. God, we thank you for the wisdom of Solomon. We thank you for his prayer, for earthly kings and for the King of Kings. Help us to try to follow the example that Solomon wanted for